In the early hours of a Harlem morning, before the jazz horns warmed the air, and before storefront gates rose with metallic groans, there was a kind of stillness that belonged only to men who carried responsibility in their bones. The city at dawn was not loud, it was thoughtful. It waited. Bumpy Johnson liked that hour. He stood by the window of his modest brownstone office on 138th Street, hands folded behind his back, hat resting carefully on the desk. He watched the light stretch slowly over brick walls that had known both triumph and humiliation. Harlem was not just a neighborhood to him. It was a promise. The streets had not always treated him kindly. Years earlier, when he first walked those same blocks as a young man with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, he had felt what every ambitious black man in America felt in that era, the weight of being underestimated. Doors that opened for others were politely closed for him. Respect was conditional. Opportunity was rationed. But Bumpy did not rage at doors. He studied hinges. He believed. Power was not taken in bursts of fury. It was built brick by brick, with patience, intelligence, and a refusal to be diminished. That philosophy had earned him something unusual in his world. Respect without spectacle, that he was not the loudest man in the room. He did not need to be, yet on this particular morning, the quiet felt heavier than usual. There had been whispers that downtown interests were tightening their grip, whispers that certain figures were unhappy that Harlem's affairs were increasingly handled by its own people rather than dictated by outsiders. Whispers that Bumpy's calm influence was becoming inconvenient. In another man, that might have sparked paranoia. In Bumpy, it sparked reflection. He poured himself a cup of coffee, slow and deliberate. He sat at his desk and opened the book of Langston Hughes poetry. Some men sharpen knives in tense moments. Bumpy sharpened thought. A knock came at the door, hesitant. "Come in," he said softly. A young man entered, hat in hand, barely in his 20s. His suit was clean but worn at the cuffs. His eyes carried a mixture of pride and frustration. "Mr. Johnson," the young man began carefully, "they shut us down again." Bumpy didn't look up immediately. He turned the page of his book first, then lifted his eyes. "Who shut you down?" "The supplier. Said they can't do business with us no more. Said it ain't appropriate." The word hung in the air, like a sour taste. Appropriate. Bumpy had heard that word his entire life. He gestured for the young man to sit. "What's your name?" Bumpy asked. "Calvin, sir." "Calvin," Bumpy repeated, as if committing it to memory. "You opened that storefront last month, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And your customers?" "Line out the door most evenings." Bumpy nodded once. "Business is good." "Yes, sir." "And yet someone has decided your success is inappropriate." Calvin swallowed. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. His voice did not rise. "It never did. Tell me something, Calvin. When a man says you are inappropriate, what he really means is that you are inconvenient." Calvin blinked. Bumpy stood and walked to the window again. "Success from the wrong hands makes certain people uncomfortable," he continued, "but discomfort is not your burden to carry." He turned back toward the young man. "You will not close that store. You will not shrink yourself to fit someone else's comfort. But without supplies, you will have them," Bumpy said simply. There was no boast in his tone, no threat, just certainty. Calvin hesitated. "Why would you help me, sir?" Bumpy's expression softened. "Because someone helped me once," he replied. "And because Harlem stands taller when its young men refuse to bow." That phrase would echo later in ways none of them yet understood. Across the river, in rooms filled with polished mahogany and cigar smoke, the conversation was very different. Downtown businessmen did not speak about Harlem as a community. They spoke of it as territory, revenue, influence. And increasingly, they spoke of Bumpy Johnson. "He's too calm," one man muttered, tapping ash into a crystal tray. "Calm men are predictable," another replied. No, the first man corrected, voice tightening. Calm men are dangerous. You never see them coming. They did not hate Bumpy because he was loud or reckless. They resented him because he was disciplined, because he built loyalty through fairness rather than fear, because Harlem trusted him. That trust disrupted arrangements, and disruption invited correction. Back in Harlem, word traveled quickly that Calvin's supply issue had been resolved within 48 hours. No shouting, no public retaliation, just a quiet shift in logistics. Calvin's storefront reopened, fully stocked. The line outside grew longer. Neighbors noticed. They noticed that when one of their own faced unfair pressure, something steady and unseen moved behind the scenes to restore balance. That steadiness had a name, but Bumpy did not seek acknowledgement. He attended church on Sunday, nodding respectfully to elders. He listened more than he spoke. He donated anonymously when families struggled. His power was real, but it was restrained, and restraint unsettled men who believed power should be visible. One evening, as jazz spilled from the Savoy ballroom and laughter rolled into the street, a well-dressed visitor from downtown arrived unannounced at Bumpy's office. He did not remove his gloves. "Mr. Johnson," the man said coolly, "there's concern that you're expanding influence beyond what was previously understood." Bumpy motioned toward a chair but did not insist the man sit. "Concern from whom?" Bumpy asked. "Concern from those who prefer balance." "Balance," Bumpy repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes." Bumpy folded his hands. "Balance implies fairness," he said calmly. "If your concern is fairness, then we agree." The visitor's jaw tightened. "You're being warned." "No," Bumpy replied gently. "You're being listened to." Silence thickened between them. The visitor finally removed his gloves. "Not out of comfort, but discomfort. You don't seem to understand the implications." Bumpy's eyes were steady. "Oh, I understand them," he said. "But I also understand something else." "And what is that?" "That fear is loud. Respect is quiet." The visitor left without another word. Outside, the music continued. The night carried on, but a line had been drawn, not in aggression, but in dignity. Later that night, Bumpy walked home alone. The city lights flickered in puddles along the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a trumpet wailed with melancholy beauty. He was not naive. He knew resistance would grow. He knew men who thrived on intimidation would not appreciate being met with composure. But he also knew something deeper. Harlem was watching. The children playing stickball. The shop owners trying to build something lasting. The young men like Calvin who needed proof that they did not have to bend to survive. If Bumpy bowed, even slightly, the message would ripple. So he would not bow. No matter the cost. As he reached his door, he paused briefly and looked back at the street, at the brownstones, the lamplight, the fragile hope stitched into every brick. He removed his hat and whispered softly, almost to himself, "Dignity first." The wind carried the words away, but the city heard them anyway. The wind changed before the men did. In Harlem, change was never announced with headlines. It moved through glances held a second too long, through conversations that stopped when certain names were spoken, through music that sounded just a little tighter, as if even the trumpets were bracing for something unseen. A week had passed since the downtown visitor left Bumpy Johnson's office with stiff shoulders and wounded pride. Nothing loud had happened. Since, no gunfire, no raids, no public confrontations, and that silence was the most unsettling part. Bumpy understood something most men in power did not. Retaliation does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives disguised as opportunity. He sensed it the moment the invitation came. It was handwritten on thick cream paper, folded with deliberate care. The message was brief: a private dinner, mutual interests. Respectfully requested. Location was a restaurant downtown that had once denied entry to black patrons unless they were entertainers. Now it extended a formal invitation to Harlem's most composed son. Bumpy read the note twice, then placed it neatly back into its envelope. Across the desk, his longtime associate Jackson shifted in his seat. "You ain't thinking of going, are you?" Bumpy's expression remained unreadable. "If a man requests conversation," he replied calmly, "I prefer to hear what he believes he can offer." Jackson frowned. "Or what he thinks he can take." Bumpy allowed the faintest smile. "Sometimes. Those are the same thing." He stood, buttoning his coat with careful precision. "I will attend," he said. Jackson shook his head. "They don't invite without purpose." "No," Bumpy agreed. "They don't." But he did not decline, because dignity does not hide from confrontation. It meets it, upright. The restaurant shimmered with polished brass and crystal chandeliers that seemed determined to outshine one another. White tablecloths glowed beneath golden light. Conversations hung softly between silverware and wine glasses. When Bumpy entered, the room noticed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but noticed. A few eyes narrowed, a few brows lifted. The mater. Dee greeted him with the polished smile of someone trained in politeness but unfamiliar with sincerity. "Mr. Johnson, we are honored." Bumpy removed his gloves slowly, his movements unhurried. "Honor is earned," he said gently. "But thank you." He was led to a private room at the back where 3 men waited around a long oak table. Their suits were immaculate, their hair parted precisely, their smiles rehearsed. One of them stood as Bumpy entered. "Mr. Johnson," he said warmly, extending a hand. "We appreciate your willingness to engage." Bumpy accepted the handshake, his grip firm but unthreatening. "I appreciate clarity," he replied. The dinner began with pleasantries. Wine was poured, appetizers served, compliments exchanged, but beneath the surface, tension coiled like a restrained animal. Finally, the tallest of the 3 men leaned forward. "You've done remarkable things in Harlem," he began smoothly. "Stability, growth, community loyalty." Bumpy nodded slightly but did not interrupt. "However," the man continued, "growth can disrupt established arrangements." "There is no disruption in fairness," Bumpy replied quietly. The second man interjected, his tone tightening. "Fairness depends on perspective." "Indeed," Bumpy agreed. "And whose perspective currently holds authority?" Silence followed. The third man, who had not yet spoken, placed his fork down deliberately. "Mr. Johnson," he said, voice cooler now, "we believe cooperation would benefit everyone involved." "And cooperation," Bumpy asked softly, "would require what precisely?" The answer came without hesitation. "Limitation." The words settled between them like smoke. "Limitation of your expansion. Limitation of influence. A gentleman's understanding." Bumpy folded his hands on the table. "And if I decline this understanding?" The tallest man smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Declining cooperation often invites complications." There it was, not a threat, an implication. Bumpy leaned back slightly, studying each face as though memorizing it for future reflection. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "Harlem is not expanding beyond its right. It is merely claiming what it has long been denied." One of the men scoffed lightly. "You speak as if this is moral philosophy." Bumpy's gaze sharpened, though his tone remained steady. "It is." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You mistake this city for a courtroom," the second man said quietly. "This is business." "Business without morality," Bumpy replied, "is merely exploitation dressed in a suit." The third man's jaw tightened. "You are overestimating your position." "No," Bumpy said gently, "I am protecting it." The dinner ended without dessert. Bumpy stood first. "I will not agree to limitation," he said calmly. "But I will always agree to fairness." "And if fairness isn't extended?" the tallest man asked. Bumpy placed his gloves back on. Then I remained patient. He walked out without haste, but outside the restaurant, beneath the glow of street lamps, something had shifted. They would not negotiate further. They would test him. The first sign came. Quietly, Calvin's store received a sudden inspection notice. Citing obscure violations, paperwork stalled. Deliveries delayed again. Insurance rates inexplicably doubled. Not violence. Pressure. Calculated. Legal. Humiliation. Disguised as regulation. Calvin arrived at Bumpy's office, with worry etched into his young face. "They're squeezing us slow," he said. "Customers scared, suppliers nervous." Bumpy listened without visible anger. "This is what fear does," he said softly. "It attempts to isolate. What do we do?" Bumpy stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street, where children still laughed, unaware of boardroom games. "We do not react loudly," he replied. "We respond wisely." That night, instead of retaliation, Bumpy hosted a gathering, not of enforcers, of pastors, business owners, teachers, barbers, women who ran boarding houses, men who organized church funds. He spoke not of conflict, but of unity. "If one storefront is targeted," he told them, "we all become vulnerable. But if one storefront thrives because we stand together, the pressure weakens." He did not ask for loyalty. He invited ownership. Within days, customers flooded Calvin's store deliberately. Other local shop owners shared suppliers. Community members publicly supported Harlem-owned businesses. The pressure did not disappear, but it failed to isolate. Downtown noticed, and their frustration deepened. Then came the turning point no one expected. City council hearing was scheduled regarding zoning adjustments that would disproportionately impact Harlem businesses. The vote was expected to pass quietly. Paperwork buried beneath bureaucratic language. Bumpy received word the night before. Jackson slammed his fist on the desk. "They think you won't show." Bumpy adjusted his tie. "They hope I won't," he replied. The next morning, Bumpy Johnson walked into City Hall not with an entourage, but alone. The chamber buzzed with muted indifference as officials shuffled documents. When his name was called for comment, a few raised eyebrows followed him to the podium. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He spoke slowly. "Gentlemen," he began, "I have listened carefully to your proposal. It is written in language that suggests improvement. Yet its impact lands only in one neighborhood." He paused. "I ask you to reconsider, not because Harlem demands privilege, but because it deserves fairness." A councilman interrupted. "This is not about race." Bumpy met his eyes evenly. "Then let us ensure it is not," he replied. There was no anger in his words, only clarity. He then did something unexpected. He unfolded a sheet of paper, listing every Harlem business owner who would be affected, each name accompanied by years of service, taxes paid, community contributions. He did not shout. He read them aloud, one by one, each name echoing softly through the chamber. The room shifted, because numbers can be dismissed, names cannot. When he finished, silence filled the space. "I will accept whatever decision you render," Bumpy said calmly. "But understand that history listens to how power treats those with less of it." He stepped away from the podium without waiting for applause. The vote was postponed. Not canceled. Postponed. But that postponement was everything, because delay meant doubt, and doubt meant the opposition was no longer certain. That evening, Harlem gathered outside Calvin's store. No celebration, just quiet presence. Bumpy walked past them without drawing attention to himself. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Is that him?" she whispered. Her mother nodded. The girl studied Bumpy carefully, as if expecting something grand, a cape perhaps, or visible strength. But she saw only a man in a dark suit walking steadily home. "Why do they listen to him?" the girl asked. Her mother smiled softly. "Because he listens first." Downtown did not retreat, they recalculated, and somewhere behind closed doors, one frustrated voice said something dangerous. If pressure won't bend him, maybe something stronger will. The wind changed again, and Harlem felt it. But so did Bumpy. He stood at his window once more that night, hands behind his back, eyes reflecting city lights. He did not look afraid. He looked resolved. They mistake patience for weakness, he murmured quietly. Then he closed the curtains, because sometimes the most powerful stance a man can take is simply refusing to kneel. The snow arrived without warning. That winter it came in thick, quiet sheets that softened the sharp edges of Harlem's brownstones and silenced the rhythm of footsteps along Lenox Avenue. Snow had a way of disguising things. It made everything look pure, untouched, innocent, even when underneath, tensions were tightening like wires pulled too far. Bumpy Johnson stood at his window again, watching flakes settle on fire escapes and window ledges. He understood something about snow. It covered, it concealed, but it did not erase what lay beneath and beneath Harlem that winter. Something was being arranged. The city council vote had not been forgotten. It had merely been postponed, and the men who preferred control to fairness had not forgiven them the embarrassment. They had expected compliance. They had received composure. Composure unsettles men who rely on intimidation. So they changed their approach. If pressure could not bend Bumpy, perhaps reputation could break him. The first newspaper article appeared on a Monday morning. It was subtle, buried near the back pages. Concerns raised over Harlem leadership influence. No accusations, no direct claims. Just carefully crafted. By Wednesday, the tone sharpened. Questions surround business arrangements in Uptown District. By Friday, it was no longer subtle. Is Harlem's stability built on hidden deals? The strategy was clear. Stain the name without presenting proof. Suggest without stating. Let whispers do the work. Jackson burst into Bumpy's office holding the paper as if it were contaminated. They're smearing you now. Bumpy glanced at the headline but did not reach for it. Words on paper, he said calmly. It ain't just words, it's doubt, and doubt spreads. Bumpy folded his hands on his desk. Yes, he said quietly. It does. Outside conversation shifted. Some were loyal, some uncertain. A few cautious. Trust, once shaken, takes time to steady. Downtown knew that, and they were patient in this approach. The true trap revealed itself 2 weeks later. An anonymous tip prompted a surprise financial audit of several Harlem businesses, including Calvin's store and 2 other establishments. Bumpy had quietly supported. Officials arrived early in the morning with polished shoes and stern expressions. Papers were demanded, records examined, inventories scrutinized. Nothing illegal was found, but the implication remained, and implication is often more damaging than evidence. That afternoon, a formal letter arrived for Bumpy Johnson himself. A summons to appear before a special investigative committee reviewing organizational conduct. It was not a criminal charge. It was not an arrest. It was something more dangerous. It was a stage, a public hearing, a performance designed to place him under bright lights and invite suspicion. Jackson paced the office. They want you rattled. They want you defensive. Bumpy read the letter twice, then placed it neatly in his drawer. They want reaction, he corrected. And what you giving them? Bumpy stood slowly. Stillness. The hearing room was larger than the city council chamber. Rows of seats filled with observers, some curious, some skeptical, some quietly supportive. Reporters lined the back wall. The committee members sat elevated, their expressions carefully neutral. Bumpy walked in alone. No entourage. No theatrics. Just a man in a dark suit with polished shoes and a hat held respectfully in his hands. He took his seat without hesitation. The questioning began politely. Mr. Johnson, can you clarify your relationship with certain Harlem businesses? I Support enterprise, he replied evenly. That is no secret. Are you financially invested? When appropriate. Are you aware of concerns regarding influence? Influence, Bumpy said softly, depends on whether it is used to build or to exploit. A murmur moved through the room. One committee member leaned forward. Are you denying that your presence shapes outcomes in Harlem? Bumpy met his gaze without blinking. My presence encourages ownership, he said. Ownership shapes outcomes. They shifted tactics. Do you consider yourself above city oversight? No. Above established arrangements? I consider fairness to be above arrangements. He answered calmly. The room grew warmer. The line of questioning sharpened. Circling, probing, searching for contradiction. Bumpy did not rush answers. He did not raise his voice. He did not take offense. And that frustrated them, because the hearing had been designed to provoke. To push him into a defensive posture. To create a headline of anger or defiance. Instead, they received composure. Finally, one committee member attempted a direct strike. Mr. Johnson, some believe your leadership creates division between Harlem and the rest of the city. What do you say to that? Silence settled. Bumpy stood slowly. He adjusted his jacket, then spoke without theatrics. Division is created when fairness is withheld, he said. Harlem does not seek separation. It seeks respect. He paused. If stability in Harlem feels like division to some, perhaps they are uncomfortable with equality. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No shouting. No insult. Just truth framed with restraint. The committee chair cleared his throat. This hearing will be adjourned pending further review. No conclusion. No condemnation. No victory. But no collapse either. Outside the building, snow had begun falling again. Reporters shouted questions. Mr. Johnson, do you feel targeted? He stopped briefly. I feel patient, he replied. Then he walked on. That night, however, something darker moved beneath the surface. Downtown's frustration deepened. They had expected misstep. Instead, they had witnessed discipline. And discipline, when exposed publicly, builds loyalty. Harlem watched that hearing. They saw not a man cornered, but a man composed, and something shifted in the streets. Where doubt had flickered, confidence returned. Calvin reopened later hours. 2 new storefronts began renovations. Church donations increased. Support became visible. Downtown had intended to weaken Harlem's faith in Bumpy. Instead, they strengthened it. That realization unsettled the men behind the curtain. One of them finally said what the others had avoided. He cannot be embarrassed. He cannot be pressured. He cannot be provoked. Silence followed. Then, a quieter voice. Then, perhaps he must be isolated. Isolation is more dangerous than accusation, because it removes support without spectacle. The next move came not against business, but against community. A permit for a long-standing Harlem cultural festival was suddenly denied due to safety concerns. The festival was more than music. It was pride. History. Identity. Children reciting poetry. Veterans honored. Local vendors thriving. Canceling it would send a message deeper than any headline. Jackson stormed into Bumpy's office again. This is deliberate. Yes, Bumpy replied calmly. They trying to choke the spirit now. Bumpy rose from his chair. Spirit, he said thoughtfully, is not easily choked. What we doing? Bumpy reached for his coat. We attend the denial meeting. The meeting was small, bureaucratic, dismissive. Officials cited vague regulations, safety codes. Insurance concerns. Bumpy listened carefully. When they finished, he did not argue. He asked a single question. If the concern is safety, what specific adjustments are required? They exchanged glances. Well, additional personnel. We can arrange that. Temporary barricades. We can arrange that. Revised time limits. We can arrange that. Their objections began collapsing under cooperation. Finally, one official leaned back in frustration. "You're making this difficult." Bumpy's eyes were steady. "I'm making this possible." Silence filled the room, because obstruction requires resistance, and he was offering solutions. Instead, they could not deny the permit without exposing motive. 3 days later, the festival was reinstated with minor modifications. When the news spread, Harlem did not cheer loudly. They stood taller quietly. The festival night arrived under crisp winter air. Music filled the streets. Children laughed. Elders nodded with approval. Bumpy walked through the crowd unnoticed by many, but felt by all. At one point, Calvin approached him. "They tried to corner you," he said softly. Bumpy watched a young girl recite poetry on the stage. "They are still trying," he replied. "And?" Bumpy smiled faintly. "A corner only traps a man who forgets he can stand still." Calvin frowned, confused. Bumpy clarified gently. "When you stop reacting to the walls, you realize they are not closing in. They are revealing themselves." The music swelled. The festival thrived. Downtown watched from a distance, realizing something crucial. They had built a trap, but Bumpy had refused to step into it emotionally. And without emotional reaction, the trap had no teeth. Later that evening, as snowflakes drifted again through streetlight glow, Bumpy stood at the edge of the festival stage and looked out at Harlem. Not with ownership, with guardianship. He knew the struggle was not over. He knew pressure would return in new forms, but he also knew something deeper. Every attempt to humiliate him had instead displayed his restraint. Every attempt to isolate him had strengthened unity. They were not fighting a man. They were confronting a principle, and principles are harder to corner than people. As the music reached its crescendo, Bumpy closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, in resolve, because the next move would not be bureaucratic. It would not be public. It would not be subtle. He felt it. The snow did not hide it. The wind did not disguise it. The opposition had run out of quiet strategies. And when quiet strategies fail, desperate ones begin. The stage lights glowed behind him as children danced in front. Bumpy opened his eyes slowly. "They will try something louder next," he murmured to himself. But his voice did not carry fear, only readiness. And somewhere, in the distance, beyond the music and laughter, beyond the softened snow and glowing lamplight, men sat in dim rooms discussing a final measure. A measure that would test not just his composure, but his survival. Harlem celebrated that night, unaware that the greatest trial was no longer political. It was personal. The wind did not howl that night. It whispered. Harlem had grown accustomed to pressure. It had endured scrutiny, suspicion, delayed votes, and denied permits. But pressure applied to a community is different from pressure applied to a man. A community absorbs. A man stands alone, and on that final winter evening, Bumpy Johnson stood alone. The festival had ended weeks earlier, but its echo lingered. Pride had returned to storefront windows. Business had stabilized. The newspapers had grown quieter, their headlines no longer able to feed on uncertainty. That silence unsettled downtown, more than any public protest ever could, because silence meant stability. And stability meant influence. And influence, when it could not be controlled, became intolerable. So they abandoned bureaucracy. They abandoned implication. They chose exposure. The plan was simple, not violent, not criminal. Strategic. A powerful consortium of down investors would announce a sweeping redevelopment initiative targeting several Harlem blocks. The language would be polished: modernization, revitalization, partnership. But buried within the proposal was a quiet clause: acquisition. Properties would be bought at fair market value. Businesses relocated, temporarily. Ownership restructured for long-term sustainability. It was displacement disguised as opportunity, and the announcement would be made publicly at a grand press event. with city officials present, placing Harlem's leadership in a position where refusal would appear unreasonable. They would not attack Bumpy directly. They would make him choose between appearing cooperative or obstructive. And this time, they believed, the optics would win. The invitation arrived with gold lettering, Joint Economic Vision Press Conference. Location: a grand hotel ballroom downtown. Guest of honor: Harlem's representative leadership, Jackson. Read it aloud in disbelief. They want you standing beside them. Bumpy held the card thoughtfully. They want legitimacy, he said quietly. And if you don't go? They'll say Harlem refused progress, Jackson paced. This ain't pressure. It's a trap. Bumpy nodded once. Yes, he agreed. It is. But he did not decline, because refusing to enter the room would surrender the narrative. And Bumpy Johnson never surrendered narratives. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished marble floors. Photographers positioned themselves strategically. Reporters adjusted notepads. Politicians rehearsed neutral smiles. When Bumpy entered, the room shifted, not because he was loud, but because he was calm. He wore a dark overcoat, hat carried respectfully at his side, no entourage, no visible tension. He shook hands with measured courtesy. The consortium leader, a silver-haired man with rehearsed warmth, greeted him publicly. Mr. Johnson, we are thrilled to partner with Harlem. Partner. The word hung in the air. Bumpy nodded politely. I look forward to hearing the details, he replied. The press conference began with applause. Slides displayed architectural renderings, gleaming buildings, modern storefronts, promises of jobs and infrastructure. The audience murmured approvingly. Then came the key moment. And of course, the consortium leader announced smoothly, we have secured preliminary agreements ensuring smooth transitions for existing property holders. A subtle glance toward Bumpy. We are grateful for Harlem's leadership cooperation. Cameras turned. Eyes shifted. The implication was clear. Consent had been assumed. Bumpy had not yet spoken. The microphone was offered to him with polite ceremony. This was the moment they had engineered. If he rejected the proposal outright, he would appear anti-progress. If he accepted it, Harlem would slowly lose ownership. It was a perfectly balanced trap. The room fell silent as he approached the podium. He did not rush. He adjusted the microphone gently. He scanned the audience, investors, officials, reporters, observers. Then he began. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, progress is a beautiful word. Nods. It suggests movement, growth, hope. More nods. But progress without participation is not partnership. A flicker in the consortium leader's eyes. Bumpy continued. I have listened carefully to the proposal presented tonight. The renderings are impressive, the language generous. He paused deliberately. However, I would like clarification on one point. The room tightened. Ownership. A faint rustle moved through the audience. Will Harlem's current property holders retain controlling ownership in these developments? Silence. The consortium leader shifted slightly. Well, restructuring would involve shared equity. Shared. Bumpy repeated softly. With whom holding majority stake? The answer hesitated. Investment groups will require oversight to ensure viability. There it was. Oversight. Translation. Control. Bumpy nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate the transparency. He stepped back from the microphone briefly, as if considering. Then he leaned forward again. Harlem welcomes investment, he said evenly, but Harlem does not surrender ownership. The words landed quietly, yet heavier than any accusation. And the words landed quietly, yet heavier than any accusation. Reporter raised a hand. Mr. Johnson, are you rejecting the redevelopment initiative? Bumpy turned toward the question. I am inviting revision, he replied. The room stirred. Revision that ensures existing property owners maintain majority control. decision-making authority, and long-term equity. He looked directly at the consortium leader. If partnership is genuine, this adjustment should not be difficult. The brilliance of the move revealed itself in that moment. He had not refused progress. He had not attacked investors. He had not accused anyone of exploitation. He had simply reframed the proposal in moral clarity, and now, refusal to adjust would expose motive. The consortium leader forced a thin smile. Of course, discussions can continue. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then stronger, because the audience had witnessed something subtle but undeniable. He had stepped into the trap and reshaped it. The headlines the next morning were different than expected. Harlem leader calls for fair ownership and redevelopment talks. Johnson advocates equity over displacement. There was no scandal. No outburst. No humiliation. Just principle. Downtown strategy had collapsed publicly. They had gambled on optics. They had encountered integrity. But the final confrontation had not yet arrived that evening. After the conference, Bumpy returned home alone. The snow had begun again, falling thick and slow. As he approached his brownstone, he noticed a figure standing beneath a street lamp. Not a threat. A familiar face. "Calvin, you all right?" Calvin asked quietly. Bumpy removed his gloves slowly. "I am." Calvin hesitated. "They keep trying." "Yes," Bumpy replied, "and you keep standing." Bumpy looked up at the falling snow. Standing is easier when you know who you're standing for. Calvin swallowed. "They ever scare you?" Bumpy's expression softened. "Fear visits every man," he said gently. "It only moves in when invited." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Calvin spoke again. "I used to think power meant control," he admitted. "Now I think it means responsibility." Bumpy smiled faintly. "You are learning." Weeks passed. Negotiations resumed quietly. This time, Harlem representatives were included formally. Ownership clauses were rewritten. Majority stakes preserved. Downtown, investors adjusted terms rather than withdraw entirely, because publicly abandoning the project would reveal their earlier intent. It was not total victory. It was balance, and balance, achieved without violence or humiliation, is rare. One final scene would seal the story. Spring arrived gently. The first renovated building under the revised agreement reopened with Harlem families listed as primary owners. A ribbon-cutting ceremony was held, modest, sincere. Bumpy stood at the back of the crowd, not at the podium. When asked to speak, he declined. "This is not about me," he said softly. Instead, Calvin, now confident, steady, stepped forward. "This building stands because someone refused to bow," he told the crowd. Bumpy lowered his eyes slightly. The applause that followed was not loud. It was deep. It carried gratitude. It carried respect. It carried something more enduring than fear. Dignity. That night, Bumpy returned once more to his office window. The city lights looked different. Not because the city had changed completely, but because Harlem had. Ownership remained. Pride remained. Unity remained. He removed a folded newspaper from his desk. The original smear headline from months earlier. He studied it briefly, then, without anger, he placed it into the fireplace. The paper curled slowly into ash. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like all the attempts that had failed. Outside, children laughed. Music drifted faintly. Life continued. Bumpy Johnson did not conquer the city. He did not defeat opponents with spectacle. He did not dominate with fear. He endured, and in enduring with principle, he altered the terms of engagement. Because the greatest power is not the ability to force submission. It is the ability to refuse it. The wind moved softly through Harlem streets that night. Not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a reminder. City had tested a man and found that dignity, when rooted deeply enough, cannot be moved.